Good morning, everyone. I'm grateful for Pat's invitation to offer a few reflections on climate change and at the end, a moment for mission. You know, the first time I noticed that the climate and the weather was changing was Thanksgiving of 1973. I'd spent that fall traveling all over my native Midwest and New England on behalf of Reed College recruiting students. And I was in heaven. I was back in Indian summer in Chicago, the hard first frost in Vermont, and it was beautiful watching autumn come in Massachusetts. My family gathered in a small village on the Hudson River to celebrate Thanksgiving. And after our huge feast, we repaired outside. The weather was so deliciously warm. It was really hot, and we were out in t-shirts for several hours. And being accustomed to the gloom that comes in the Midwest and New England in winter, I thought, oh, this is a welcome relief indeed. Little did I know that that moment was a marker of the dramatic changes that we would all become aware of. Over the 40 years since then, I found myself noticing, occasionally at first, and then very, very often, that in fact it wasn't not just the climate, it was the weather that was changing. The weather was changing, but the climate was changing. In the early 90s, my wife Helen and I decided to take our 3 children on a dramatic trip to Alaska. And the evidence of a changing climate was really hard to miss. Huge walls of ice came crashing down as they calved into Glacier Bay. The fishing trip that we took to the pure waters of the Kenai Peninsula was so warm that, again, we were dressed in t-shirts, and the forest around Mount Denali were dead and askew because the permafrost had thawed the ground. This, I thought, was hardly the place that Jack London had described in his stories of the bitter cold Klondike. About this time, I read Al Gore's first book, Earth in the Balance, which explained to me the concept of greenhouse gases and the idea that not only was the climate changing, we humans with our modern lifestyles were causing the shift. I began to express my concern to friends and professional colleagues and to my family back in the Midwest and the East. At first, my family was rather bemused. Oh, Paul's living out in Berkeley, and you know they have some pretty strange ideas out there. But over time, the evidence began to build for me and for all of us. Elizabeth Colbert, a writer for New Yorker, cataloged, and she's like many modern writers, has cataloged these things, the impact of climate change, extreme weather, hurricanes, drought, punishing heat, melting ice caps, rising sea levels. Faced with this global crisis, I asked myself, what could I as one person possibly do? Well, we began at home. We insulated our 1925 Berkeley house, installed CFL light bulbs that I bought right out here in the large assembly, embraced the city's recycling program with zeal. We put solar panels on our roof to take the house and the home off the grid. Encouraged by my wife, Helen, I also helped my school pursue a goal to become more environmentally sustainable. And 3 years ago, I actually decided to retire from my job so that I could devote my energies full-time to this important issue. I traveled across the country visiting more than 100 schools, colleges, and environmental organizations, and have written a book called Greening America's Schools just to tell their heroic story of the changes that they're embracing. In his inaugural address in January, President Obama said, "We, the people, still believe that our obligations as Americans are not just to ourselves, but to all posterity. We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations." I was so impressed, excited, and inspired by his words. And that is why I believe that we at FCCB have a moral obligation not only to change our individual actions as members of the community, but to think about the institution itself and to help FCCB as a church be as environmentally sustainable as it can be. Our Green Team mission says we can do this by promoting environmental stewardship so that we may respect, enjoy, and preserve God's gift of life on earth. And we can do that in our worship as has been happening all this year in our education program, in our facilities, and our outreach into the community. Last Sunday, we learned about Mission 4-1 Earth, and there will be 50 days between Easter and the Pentecost when we will be invited to join the UCC's national effort. We're going to try to generate 1 million hours of service. That's not just here in our congregation. We'll have allies, and plant 100,000 trees and write 100,000 letters to advocate for green policies. In fact, we started that campaign this morning inspired by Interfaith Power and Light. And we have a petition we're sending to the president just encouraging him to really devote much time and energy and resources to his pledge from the inaugural. We already have 48 members of the congregation who've signed. I'll be out in the foyer at the end if you'd like to add your name. When I was a principal, the children at Headroy showed me a way we can all respond to the environmental crisis. They created a DOT campaign. DOT stands for Do One Thing. They went all over the school asking, what's your DOT? What's your DOT? I get up every day and I think about that. What's my DOT? And I hope that you will think too. What's your DOT? Amen.